Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the DiversiTree webinar. I'm Chris Williams from the Royal Forestry Society. We're a forestry education charity dedicated to sharing knowledge on the art and science of woodland management. You can find out more details on our web pages. So, in terms of today's webinar, we all know that forests and trees provide a huge range of public benefits, from timber, carbon storage, biodiversity, many other benefits. But we also know that our trees and forests are under increasing threat from climate change and a number of pests and diseases. And these threats can and will affect trees such as Sitka spruce, which we're very dependent upon for our timber, and I'm sure many people will know. So to help our woodlands more resilient to these threats, there's been an increasing interest in the broader subject of woodland diversity, which I know means many different things. And that's what we're going to explore at the webinar today. So I'd like to introduce the panel. Joining us, we have Dr. Ruth Mitchell, Biodiversity and Ecosystems Group Leader at the James Hutton Institute. And Ruth is the Principal Investigator for DiversiTree and leading on the Biodiversity Work Package. We also have Dr. Norman Dandy, Senior Research Fellow in Sustainable Land Use at Bangor University. And Norman is leading on the Social Science Work Package for DiversiTree. And also joining us is Dr. Chris Nicholls, Conservation Evidence Manager at Woodland Trust. And Chris is leading the Solutions and Knowledge Exchange Work Package. I hope I got all that right. So I'll now hand over to Ruth.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thanks for a great introduction. And thank you all for joining us this lunchtime and for coming inside and being with us rather than enjoying this wonderful weather we're having. I will now share my screen. Well, we're taking this opportunity to tell you a bit about our project called DiversiTree. This is part of, or one of 12 projects that's funded by the UK Research Council's programme of research that they're running at the moment called Treescapes. So overall, Treescapes is conducting a range of research looking at how we can, the sort of impacts of the current plans of increasing the woodland cover in the UK. And DiversiTree, as Chris said, is particularly focusing on how we want to diversify our woodlands. So the project only started in August. It's a 2-year project. So what we hope to do today is very much outline to you what we're wanting to do, and maybe to get your feedback about how we could include any of your comments in the work as we go along. So the project is a collaboration between the James Hutton Institute up in Aberdeen, which some of you might previously have heard of as the Macaulay Institute, Bangor University, Birmingham University, the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, the RSPB, and the Woodland Trust. And we also have project partners of the Forest Research and Nature Scott. And the overall aim of DiversiTree is very much, as Christopher said, to look at how we might be able to increase the diversity of our woodlands to increase resilience. And we want to do this by working across a range of scales. So I've put in there from microbes to mines. And we've deliberately got the mines in there to show that the human aspect of this is really important as well. And we want to understand the methods too, and the impacts of diversifying tree species composition. So just to sort of pictorially try and describe what we're looking at, many of our current native woodlands and our commercial woodlands are actually quite species poor in terms of their tree species composition. And as we know, we're facing a range of pests and pathogens that could impact particular tree species or climate change. And if any particular pest or pathogen impacts one tree species, and that woodland is composed or dominated by one tree species, then we potentially lose a large proportion of the trees in those woodlands. On the other hand, if we have a more diverse woodland, the theory goes that we can have the same range of pests and pathogens, but we might only lose a small proportion of the trees in our woodlands. So why might more diverse woodlands be more resilient? Well, we think that more diverse woodlands can offer a greater range of functions, of ecological functions. And an example from this comes from agriculture. In agricultural systems, if you have a more diverse range of crops, you have a more diverse range of predators, and that helps control the pests and the pathogens in the system. But we don't know if the same occurs in woodlands. Also, if we have a more diverse woodland, then potentially one tree species can substitute for another. So if we lose a tree species, other tree species might fulfill that ecological niche and be able to deliver many of the same functions. But obviously, woodlands are not just about trees, they're about the people that manage them, and we need to be aware of their values and their ambitions in terms of managing the woodlands and what they think of in terms of a diverse woodland going forward into the future, and their ambitions for making those woodlands more resilient. And they need to have the available knowledge to make the woodlands more resilient. So our project has therefore got what we've called 4 ambitions, or 4 challenges rather, and I'll talk you through these 4 challenges. So the first challenge we're looking at is very much around woodland managers. So people like yourselves that are managing woodlands, how do woodland managers understand woodland diversity? At what sort of scale are they interested in? Are they thinking at the stand scale, at a larger whole site scale, or at a landscape scale? And what are their ambitions in relation to a future woodlands? What would they see as the tree species of the future? Secondly, we want to look at whether increased tree diversity can help us increase ecosystem functionality. So by that we mean, can that increased tree species diversity provide resistance against pests and pathogens? Thirdly, we want to see how increased tree species diversity can provide greater functionality for the biodiversity, how it can help support a greater range of biodiversity. And then finally, obviously, it's really important to actually communicate this and to discuss management strategies to increase resilience in our woodlands. And we're specifically looking at 4 management strategies. So we're looking at continuous forest cover, natural regeneration, planting of novel species, and then microbial diversification. And we'll come back onto those later. And I should say that we're specifically focusing on tree species diversification here. We're aware that there's also a lot of talk about genetic diversification, and that could also be important in the resilience of our forests. But there are other projects within the Treescapes programme looking at genetic diversity. So just to give you an overview of our project that you can see here, and key to this is the fact that we've also got a project advisory board that's providing high-level sort of links to other policies. So we've got people like DEFRA on that, and then we've also got a practitioners panel that Chris will talk more about later. So we're specifically focusing on conifers in this project. We can't cover everything, it's only a 2-year project. And we focus on conifers because most of the new planting that's going on is still conifers. And we're specifically focusing on Sitka, because as Chris said, that's the sort of non-native species that's commercially planted in the majority. And then Scots pine as our native conifer, at least up in Scotland. But we're very much wanting to look at the transferability of the results to other woodland types. And certainly in some of the sort of social areas of our research, we're very much broadening out into other woodland types as well. So what we're going to do is talk you through our 4 work packages, which address those 4 challenges I mentioned. And Norma is going to talk you through our first work package.
Thank you, Ruth. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Great to see so many people joining us for the webinar. I'm Norman Dandy. I work at Bangor University, as Chris has already said, and myself and my colleague Seamus are responsible for delivering work package 1, which is focused on understandings of and ambitions for woodland diversity. So we understand that and we recognise fully that, of course, diversity, woodland diversity, we are not introducing it as an idea to our forestry sector and to our woodland owners. Obviously, lots of people have been thinking about woodland and their diversity for a very long time. And we want to capture those understandings, those existing understandings of diversity within the woodland. Now, we've kind of constructed these two straw people, if you like, in terms of existing ideas about woodland diversity and where resistance to diversification might actually come from. So at one end of our spectrum of straw people, we have the conservation woodland owner who might resist diversifying away from designated lists of species relating to particularly nativeness and provenance and things like that. There may be a restricted range of species on that list that they would not want to stray from, or in fact could not stray from in terms of legislated protected areas and things like that. So that might be one source of resistance to diversification. Another source of resistance to diversification might be from production orientated managers for whom economic priorities, logistics, all of those things that we recognize as an important parts of our commercial sector, they focus on single species, Sitka, Douglas, other kind of a small number of species in broadly monoculture type forest environments, forest settings. So that might be another source of resistance to diversification. To a diverse production woodland could bring additional economic issues or logistical challenges. We absolutely recognise that those are indeed straw people. Production orientated owners obviously often have conservation objectives embedded in their management plans, and similarly conservation orientated managers can often have production, possibly small scale objectives as well. So our first target is to understand those ideas about diversity and woodland diversity and diversification amongst our existing owners along these sort of types. Secondly, we want to understand what the ambitions for diversity might be in the future. So we want to ask questions around, whether our woodlands are actually as diverse as they need to be at the moment, and at what scale should they be diverse? Should it be stand level? Should it be forest level? Should it be landscape level? So once we understand the current situation, once we understand the ambitions, where we want to get to in the future, of course we have the logical link there, which is the how do we get there? What are the strategies for moving from where we are to where we want to be, assuming that we want to diversify in some of our woodlands. So if I can ask you to move on to the next slide, please, Ruth, and then I can just talk about the methods a little bit. Okay, so thank you. So first thing to mention is that in any research involving people, we absolutely need to ensure ethical approval. So our project has been approved by the Bangor University Ethics Committee. So that's important to note. The methods that we're going to be using in relation to objective 1.1, which is the existing understandings of woodland diversity, we're going to be doing some literature and policy review. So to look at where ideas of diversity have particularly permeated into woodland policy, to forest policy, and how it's been thought about in the scientific literature. So there's some literature type work there. But also we want to, and we are undertaking interviews with forest managers, primarily forest managers that are managing Scots pine and or Sitka spruce. But we are in this work package also interested in talking to people beyond that have other management holdings as well. We have we've completed a number of these interviews already. 20 is a relatively modest number of interviews to try and achieve within a project. but as Ruth mentioned earlier, we haven't got the longest timescale for this project. So 20 is what we're going for. So yes, we've completed 6 and we've got some more underway. Priority research areas are Cumbria and Scotland. I hope you can't hear my dog barking in the background, but my apologies if you can. But we have some other areas as well. We'll also have an MSc student at Bangor who's going to be undertaking some work in Cumbria to feed into the project. In terms of the future visions, the future kind of ideas and ambitions about diversity and diversification, we're going to be holding a number of focus groups across 4 stakeholder groups. Two focus groups with policymakers, 2 with forest managers, 2 with community forest organisations, and 2 with forest scientists. And we will be holding those next year, but we've started to recruit onto those. So I just wanted to say before I actually finish, if anybody on the call would like to participate in this work package, like to be interviewed, like to participate in a focus group maybe, particularly anybody that has any Scots pine or Sitka spruce, but more broadly anyway, if you would like to participate, please do contact Seamus, and his email is at the bottom of the slide there. So thanks very much. That's all I wanted to say on work package 1.
Thank you very much, Norman. So moving on to work package 2. Work package 2 is led by Birmingham University, by Lisa Lambert and Rob Jackson, and they send their apologies for today. They couldn't make it, so I'm presenting their work package. So you'll have to bear with me as an ecologist tries to explain some microbiology. But essentially what they're looking at is they have what we call a hypothesis, so an idea that in monoculture woodlands, the diversity of the microbes on the leaves of the trees is actually quite low. Whereas in a more diverse woodland, they expect that the diversity of the microbes on the leaves of a tree would be more diverse. And that's the hypothesis that they're wanting to test. So they're wanting to see if that's true. And they're going to do that using some species mixtures plots that Forest Research planted in the 1960s and 70s. So there's some plots up at Ardross on the Black Isle in Scotland that have got different proportions of Scots pine and Sitka spruce in, and they've kindly allowed us to use those plots. And then we're also going to use plots down at Rosedale in Yorkshire, where they've got a greater variety of species together with Scots pine. So that's going to enable us to see how the leaf microbiome, as it's termed, those microbes on the surface of the leaf and in the leaf change. So when we talk about diversity, we need to be aware that we can measure diversity at different scales, and they're going to be taking that into account. So what this slide here is talking about is those different scales of diversity. So when we talk about alpha diversity, we're talking about diversity in a particular plot or an area, and the beta diversity is the difference or the diversity represented by 2 or more plots or areas in the overall community of, for example, that woodland. And then the gamma diversity is the diversity in the whole area. So we're specifically going to be focusing on the alpha diversity, so the diversity of microbes on an individual tree, and then the overall diversity within a plot. So as I said, we're going to use these species mixtures plots that were set up about 50 years ago, and they're going to be using some DNA techniques to extract the fungi and the bacteria and the archaea that are occurring on the leaves. And they're going to use some fancy statistics to assess whether there are differences in the diversity of the microbes, depending on whether the pine trees they sampled occur on monocultures or in mixtures. And then we're going to see whether that diversity impacts how susceptible Scots pine is to Drothystroma. As we all know, Drothystroma is a fungal pathogen that can affect Scots pine, and we're going to test whether this diversity of microbes found on the leaves can present any resistance to Scots pine Drothystroma infection. So they're going to be testing that on agar plates, so they'll extract the microbes and culture them on agar plates and look at the resistance there. And then they're also going to run an experiment in the greenhouse where they're going to spray Scots pine trees with these cultures of microbes that they've extracted and infect the Scots pine with Diversifying and see if there's any levels of resistance. So this really just summarises the overall flow of what they're going to do. They're going to extract the microbes from the needles on the Scots pine trees. They're going to culture them on the agar plates. They'll extract the microbes that they think are most resistant to Diversifying and then spray those on Scots pine. And after about 60 days, see whether that helps the Scots pine resist the Diversifying infection. Our third work package is the more ecological work package, or the sort of wider biodiversity work package. And this is the one that I'm leading in conjunction with colleagues at the RSPB and the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh. And we're looking at the wider biodiversity within our woodlands. So the species that actually utilise the trees, and particularly those Scots pine and Sitka spruce trees. And we're wanting to see how diversifying the woodlands will increase the biodiversity found and whether that will also then help improve resilience. So this idea that if, for example, something caused a decline in, say, Scots pine, will the same biodiversity still be supported because there are other species that biodiversity can use. So we're currently in the process of collating lists of all the biodiversity that's found on Scots pine and Sitka spruce trees. There isn't actually at the moment a single list for us to utilise, so we're busy doing that. And just to give you some examples of the data we've got so far, my entomology colleagues have so far got 255 invertebrates that use Scots pine, and to the best of their knowledge, only 41 of those are currently have ever been found on Scots pine. And they've got a list of over 100 invertebrates that use Sitka spruce, and to the best of their knowledge, only three of them have only been found on Sitka spruce. So once we've got a list of all the invertebrates, the mosses, the lichens, the birds, the mammals that use Scots pine and Sitka spruce, we're then going to see whether those species will also use a range of other tree species that could potentially be used to either replace Scots pine or Sitka spruce or be planted as mixtures with Scots pine and Sitka spruce. And the list of trees we're looking at includes a complete variety. So we've got some tree species that could be timber replacements and be grown for timber purposes, other tree species that very much would be planted for more native woodlands that might not have a timber objective, but might be more planted for biodiversity objectives. We're also wanting to actually sort of test how different tree species can replace each other and whether the biodiversity will use those other tree species actually in the field. And because it's only a 2-year project and we can't look at all the different species, we're focusing on lichens because they don't move about very much, so they're easy to sample. And we've been collecting the lichens from the species mixtures plots at Ardross, which are these ones with Scots pine and Sitka spruce. So we can see how the types of lichens change depending on the tree species present. And then finally, we're going to be looking at ecosystem function. And by that, I mean things like how the tree species influence the soil chemistry, leaf litter breakdown, and the soil chemical composition. So this is an example for some work I did on ash. So we looked at the soil chemical composition of ash, but also a range of other tree species that could replace ash. And you can rank them depending on their similarity to, in this case, ash. So this is the ranking in terms of the similarity of these tree species for the biodiversity they support. So oak supports much of the biodiversity that's also found on our ash trees, whereas, for example, wild cherry and poplar don't support much of the same biodiversity. If we think about ecosystem functioning, sycamore is actually quite similar to ash in terms of its functioning, whereas beech and wild cherry are very dissimilar. And we hope to do a similar sort of ranking for Scots pine and Sitka spruce. And that's the end of work package 3. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who's going to talk about our final work package.
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Nicholls, Conservation Evidence Manager at the Woodland Trust. And it's fantastic for us to be involved in a research program, a research project like this. It's a great kind of aspect of our wider conservation research program, which you might have heard of. And I see actually we've got at least one recipient of a Woodland Trust research grant on the attending this webinar today, so very nice to see you. And yes, so our research program collaborates on different research projects, whether it's something like DiversiTree, where we're kind of costed in, or whether we're funding projects ourselves, or whether we're offering up our sites and data to collaborate on projects. We've got a kind of wide portfolio of projects, but our role in DiversiTree is really as a practitioner organisation, bridging that perceived divide between academics and practitioners. And also within practitioners, there's often a lot of polarisation, especially on things like Twitter. So we really hope with DiversiTree that we're bringing everyone together to provide an evidence-based solution to the various issues and challenges around species diversification in our woodlands. So as part of this work package, we've got 3 kind of main goals, which I'll talk about. One is our practitioners panel, which you can see a nice picture of us all at our first practitioners panel meeting in the North York Moors here, looking kind of very happy and lots of cold hands. And we're also producing a range of case studies and a range of publications around different management strategies. But the broad aim of this work package is effectively to engage with folk on the ground who are actually at the business end of species diversification, and to integrate outputs from the other 3 work packages to provide a kind of a real world application for land managers, for policymakers, for a whole range of other stakeholders as well, and to avoid kind of alienation and kind of promote I suppose respect between different players in the sector. So let's move on to talk about our practitioners panel. So our practitioners panels is really about kind of adding that kind of scrutiny and feasibility to the project and to the findings of the project throughout, and not just kind of at the end, where it can sometimes be an add-on to projects, thinking about the implications and the applications. And our practitioners panel is made up of around 10 practitioners or kind of woodland managers from a whole mix of backgrounds, all working on the ground and or for different priorities of objectives in managing woodland. And we're also looking for representatives from other parts of the sector, like nurseries and sawmills. So if you would consider yourself a representative of a nursery or a sawmill, or you feel like you could represent that part of the sector on a practitioners panel for the project, then do get in touch. I'm sure we can share my email address, so you can get in touch with me if you feel like you would like to get involved. Basically, we've had 1 meeting so far, and we're planning 3 more meetings of this practitioners panel where we kind of have some field-based elements and some meeting room-based elements to really kind of thrash out the practicalities of the project and to provide that that kind of 2-way engagement and avoid it just being academics thinking of it in an academic way. No offense to the academics on the call, Ruth and Norman. I know you guys are very used to engaging with a whole range of stakeholders, but I think this just really grounds the projects. And as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, we've got a range of management strategies that we'll talk about in a second, but that's a key, I suppose a key part of the practitioners panel, is because these are the people who have been working day in, day out to diversify woods, or thinking about the challenges around diversifying woods. So it really allows that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and fostering kind of mutual understanding, different viewpoints. And we really want it to be a kind of frank discussion and a kind of no holds barred kind of discussion where kind of people can put forward in a safe space unpopular views or perceived unpopular views and really kind of just thrash it out. So yeah, let's talk about the management strategies. that we'll be producing. Well, I say producing, obviously we're not, as Norman said, it's not like we've invented diversification, and it's not like we've invented these management strategies, but I suppose we're looking to integrate the findings from other work packages like our social science work package and our biodiversity work package and our microbiome work package, to see in practice how those can be used on the ground, using these 4 management strategies that we've chosen, whether it's continuous cover forestry or novel planting regimes using species that aren't native or to that area or country, whether it's using natural regeneration or natural colonization to promote species diversification, or whether it's these kind of emerging microbial diversification strategies. It's about integrating all of the findings to see how in practice these can increase species diversity. And we're very aware that there's a lot of overlap between these approaches, and they're not kind of clear cut boundaries, but it's for the purposes of the study, it's just easier to sort of categorize them in this way. And because it's integrating the social science side of the project, we've thought that would lend itself very nicely to some podcasts as outputs, because it's quite an audio medium and kind of discipline. So yeah, look out for those in the future when we get to them. But yes, so we can also move on to talking about the case studies as outputs from the project, which are looking to be real kind of reference points for how the project can be applied on the ground. Looking at individual sites to see species, sites with Scots pine or sitka spruce elements, and how would the findings be implemented to diversify those sites? Which species would harbour or increase the biodiversity on the site, and which methodologies might support that. So our case studies will be split up into case studies looking at woodland creation sites, case studies looking at mature woodland, and Scots pine and sitka spruce for a range of objectives, as you can see on the table here. And because obviously case studies lend themselves to quite a visual output, lots of kind of nice kind of aspects to visualize, we will be producing some short videos that will be available as outputs from the project as well, to accompany the kind of more conventional PDF case studies. So lots of kind of diverse outputs from the project, which I hope it will be really engaging for a whole range of stakeholders. And I think that's all I was going to say on our solutions and knowledge exchange work package.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the team. So that's a summary of where we are with DiversiTree. Obviously it's work in progress, and if you wish, we can obviously keep you up to date as the results come out from the project. If you want to find out more about the project, we've got a Twitter account, a Mastodon account, a website, and there's my email address there. So, please do get in touch and keep in contact. But I'll stop sharing now, and I think we're going to open up to questions. But thank you all very much for listening.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Norman, and thank you, Chris. Great presentations there. And we've got a bit of time for questions, so we'll look at those. And obviously, if we don't get a chance to answer your question, please, I think we can say we can contact the team by the contact details we just shared. I thought if we go to, there's a question been posted about work program 1, which I think probably for Norman. It says, work program 1 seems to focus heavily on one of the straw people that highlighted. Is it possible to make sure the conversation is opened to nature conservation organisations and groups too, to garner the opinions of those pushing the strict idea of what natives are? Do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. The short answer is yes, absolutely we are doing. So we are, the kind of dichotomy, the split that I presented between kind of our commercially orientated managers and our conservation orientated managers, of course, that has subdivisions within it as well across our, private owners, public forest estate owners, and the third sector, our conservation organisations and others, of which, of course, Woodland Trust is a major kind of landholding third sector organisation. Within the interviews, we are seeking to engage with all of those types of owners. So we're undertaking interviews with conservation organisation managers on the ground, and yeah, that we will be seeking seeking views, seeking data from that spectrum of owners. So using owners, managers sort of broadly there. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Norman. I should have said that question was from Jonathan Burton, so thank you, Jonathan. I'd now like to go to the one posted by Vidora Morris, which is you covered it part, Ruth, about the sort of soil side of this. So the question is there scope to look at the soil microbiome as well as the leaf microbiome? Do you want to just expand on that area?
Unfortunately, there's not going to be scope to actually directly look at the soil microbiome in terms of the impact, the work that we're doing in Work Package 2. It's one of the problems, is perhaps the wrong word, but the limitations of an interdisciplinary project is, in a project like this, you end up covering a whole range of disciplines, but we can't go into depth in any one area, because I'm sure all of us could have written a complete research project about our own area. But that said, we do acknowledge that the soil microbiome is very important. We are aware of that. There's a lot of work that's currently ongoing on the soil microbiome, and it's an increasing area of sort of interest. And Work Packages 1 might wish to come in on this. We are wondering about exploring it a bit further in some of the work that's being done in terms of strategies. For management strategies, we mentioned there were 4 strategies for management that we were thinking about, and 3 of them are very defined. We've got continuous forest cover, novel planting, and natural regeneration. And then our 4th one is a bit undefined at the moment. We're wanting to link it into this idea of the microbiome, and whether we can diversify the microbiome. And we were thinking of the leaf microbiome for increasing resistance. And we were wanting to find practitioners that are maybe thinking about the microbiome and how that might influence resilience. So far, we haven't been able to actually find anybody that's actually practically thinking about this on the ground. So if any of you out there know anybody that's thinking about sort of leaf microbiome and how that influences resistance to pests and pathogens, and how you might practically implement that in your forests, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Because we haven't heard about anybody doing that type of work yet, although people are sort of talking about it hypothetically, we are wondering about moving towards looking at the soil microbiome in the sort of interviews and what we've called bright spot analyses for that part of the work. But I think that's still an area where we're working to resolve in terms of exactly where our focus might be. I don't know if Norma wishes to come in and add anything on that.
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks, Ruth. I think it's an interesting observation in the interviews we've done so far, when asking people to talk about their understanding of diversity within their woodland. The soil microbiome is an element of what people talk about. They talk about the addition of deadwood, which of course, not the addition of deadwood, sorry, but the leaving of deadwood. Which of course is a long-standing practice, and so some practices are aimed at things in that kind of soil health area, with a specific idea around kind of microbial diversity. But so far we haven't come across anybody that's thinking about the microbiome beyond the soil, either the stem of the plant or the leaf. So that's quite an interesting element of the data in itself.
And it might be that obviously there's links there. They're not separate systems. Soils and leaves, they're all part of the same system, and leaves fall into soil often. So that'd be an interesting dynamic as well, I'm sure.
Okay, that might be the DiversiTree 2, the follow-on that picks up some of those areas. Thank you all for your responses to that. So I'd like to, there's an interesting question from me and Hannah, which is about the sort of temporal aspect of climate change and how do we manage it really. So basically saying that, you know, with all the issues associated with that, especially for larch and ash, climate projections would suggest these pressures unlikely to ease. What time frame should we contemplate when trying to manage woodland composition against these pressures? That's a huge question. Who would like, Chris, would you like to have a go at that one?
Well, climate change is already happening, isn't it? So I think we can't be looking to the future to manage our woods for climate change. We need to be managing them now for climate change. So I suppose that's a short answer. I think how you do that management will depend very much on your objectives for the site and also the kind of local context. Might be different in Scotland compared to south of England, based on the impacts of climate change and all sorts of other factors like elevation of your site, or to what extent it's rural or urban, all of these different factors. So it's yeah, I think in terms of timeframes, the time is now, or you know, that old adage of 20 years ago. But yeah, so sorry, that's not a very kind of detailed response, but I suppose it's
from the engagement you've had with some of the woodland managers, has this question come up with them? Are they should already be looking at this, obviously, but is that apparent from the conversations you've had?
Yeah, actually it came up at the first practitioners panel meeting, where there was a discussion around, you know, the impact of future climates on productivity of different species, for instance, and to what extent should can we get in, for instance, sort of one more rotation, or there was the perception that maybe we should be doing one more rotation of Sitka spruce before going on to a different species. So I think you know, that there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer to that, and again it will kind of it will depend on lots of factors, but I think it's definitely something that's a really interesting discussion.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of yeah, sorry, go on.
Just going to add one little thing. I mean, of course, foresters generally think longer term anyway. That's not an answer to how long, which was the question. But we recently did some work where we were trying to advocate for policymakers to think in much longer term. And there are kind of glimmers of hope. You know, we have a 25-year plan from DEFRA. That's slightly longer term than we usually get. We have a Wellbeing and Future Generations Act in the Welsh Government, which is again a longer term mode of thinking. So I think we need to not only think about the length of time that we as forest managers need to think in terms of, but we also need to encourage our policymakers to think in those kind of ecological timeframes as well, which is not to detract from the urgency that Chris has already said of responding to climate change, but you know, both at the same time, pudding and eating it, please.
Okay, yes, well, as a plea to policymakers to continue to think long term, or at least to start to if they're not already, so certainly necessary. Another question, thank you for responses. Another question from Jonathan Burt, actually, which is quite a good one. So it says, will work program 3 look at bark pH and chemical composition to understand epiphyte associates? Would also be great to have a point to the variation of how different conifers affect soil chemistry. Is that one for you, Ruth?
I think so, yes. We haven't actually got the capacity in this project to look at how bark pH affects epiphytes, but it is well known that it does, although actually trying to get patterns is quite hard. I did similar work for another project looking at oak, and again it was similar sorts of questions about how other tree species could replace oak in terms of supporting the biodiversity. And I went around different botanic gardens. So a great resource, botanic gardens, I've discovered, because they've got all sorts of different tree species growing on sort of similar soils and similar climates. And we were looking at how the epiphytes differed between different tree species. And I was taking bark samples and looking at the bark chemistry. And I also recorded the bark texture. So sort of the number of ridges, the number of furrows, the depth of those ridges, the width of those ridges, the width of the furrows, the depth of the furrows, trying to describe the bark of the tree. And what I was hoping to do was to try and come up and say, sort of, which tree species were most similar to oak in terms of their bark characteristics, and how that then affected the epiphytes that we found on them. But it wasn't as straightforward as we'd have perhaps hoped. I think there were overriding factors in terms of the climate of, so we had like 6 or 7 sites across the whole of the UK, from Cornwall up to Aberdeenshire. And once you looked at that whole variation across the whole of the UK, there were an awful lot of other factors that were also obviously influencing the epiphyte distribution. So yes, bark chemistry is important, but so is a whole range of other factors. So trying to sort of make those predictions is not as straightforward as you might hope.
Right, okay. There's obviously there's going to be things that people are looking for that beyond the scope of this particular program, but
yeah,
there's lots to do. There's a question now from Evie Berry, says, would national mapping of woodland diversity be part of any of the package's projections?
No, it's not the short answer. I think that's an interesting point in terms of scale, and at what scale does one think about diversity, which is perhaps being touched on a bit in Work Package 1. I don't know if Chris or Norman wish to come in.
I suppose it's often thought of in terms of suitability for biodiversity, and there's forest research doing, I've got their National Forest Inventory, which assesses the condition of woods across the UK for biodiversity. So that is a kind of effectively a kind of proxy for suitability of woods for biodiversity. But yeah, I don't think there's any kind of national map of a kind of diversity index, as it were.
I think we're moving in that direction through things like advances in remote sensing technologies. I mean, within with the use of hyperspectral data and things like that, which is becoming increasingly available, we're able to start spotting disease incidence even amongst different species in different forest contexts. So there isn't a part of this project, and Ruth, I mean, we missed the trick there, but that would be very valuable, wouldn't it? A national map of woodland tree species diversity, or woodland species diversity more broadly. But I think the route to it is most likely through advances in remote sensing, coupled with long-standing biological records for kind of ground truthing that remote sensing. But yeah, great suggestion, great question.
Okay, there's lots of good suggestions coming through. There's one here from Georgie Bennett Stewart, which again may be out of the scope of the project, but I'll ask it. So, is the role of low-growing shrubs and trees understood enough in the context of the diversity project? Just giving examples: rowan, hazel, holly, yew. Has that been considered? Is that part of the?
We are certainly including some of those species that might be more thought of as sort of shrubs in our assessment of whether the biodiversity found on Scots pine and Sitka would also be hosted on them. So we have got certainly some species in our list that, yeah, you wouldn't grow for timber, but you might have in your woodland for other purposes, such as to support the biodiversity. So yes, we are including things like hazel and some of the willows and rowan and things in there for that reason. Because I think forest structure is really important as well. And it's an aspect that we're not directly working on, but we are sort of touching on when we're thinking about tree species composition, because often it's not just the species, it's the structure of that woodland that's really important for the biodiversity.
Yeah, I think we often look to tools like ESC, the ecological site classification tool, which doesn't really focus, I don't think, on those kind of shrubby species. And if I could just point to the Woodland Trust Tree Species Handbook that we produced last year, that's actually fills quite a good gap at looking at some of those species and their suitability around the UK. So yeah, just sort of I think probably one of the outputs of this project as well will be a recommendation to take into account lots of different tools and lots of different guidance to suit your needs when it comes to diversity. So it's always difficult, I think, kind of making sense of the huge range of guidance that's out there, but I think if we can support people with that in relation to diversity, that'll be very useful.
Okay, all right, thank you. So there's another one here from John's best actually. So it's for the case studies, program 4. Are the forest research, forest development types being used to help suggest silvicultural models that stands can be used, i.e. converted to or created through planting?
Well, yes, we did. That came up quite a lot in our practitioners panel meeting in March, and obviously we haven't written the case studies yet, but I'm sure that will be a big factor, especially if the sites that are being individual sites that are being used as case studies, if the site managers have been using forest development types, then it will be a big part of the case study. But yeah, it's definitely in our minds, and yeah, really interesting approach.
Okay, let me just look. There's a question from Garion. So it says, as I understand it, it's clearly stated the objectives of DiversiTree project is not to look at species and habitat diversity per se, but to look at the implications of alpha diversity, e.g. leaf microbes, in improving resilience to, for example, threats such as infectious diseases and environment stress such as climate. So, yeah, does anybody want to comment on that?
So again, I guess it goes back to the question of scale. Is that what the question's referring to? So we're not actually looking at sort of habitat diversity in different woodland types. I guess that's might end up being implicit in some of the discussions we have within the practitioners panel and within the interviews in work package 1. I don't know if that's a very good answer.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, it's difficult to kind of read the questions and find
Yeah.
understand them at the same time. So it's so it's talking about, you've already covered it, I think, in the presentation, about sort of alpha diversity for improving resilience, which is what you covered. So I think the short answer is yes, that's what it's achieving to do. I've got a question myself about the sort of transferability, because you mentioned, I think Ruth, you mentioned this sort of focus on conifers, and so I was just interested in your thoughts on how applicable it might be to, say, broadleafs or mixed woodlands. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's very much something we're wanting to discuss with the practitioners panel and our advisory board as we go through the project. And that's one of their sort of roles, is to try and help us see how applicable some of the things we are coming up with are to other woodlands. So yeah, I think we've had to focus in just because of the constraints of the time we've got, but at the same time we want to make the results, broaden it out at the end, I guess, and make the results as applicable as we can within the limits of our current knowledge. I don't know if Chris and Norman wish to add anything.
I can just say that I think some of the work from work package 1, where we were talking to managers, I think that will be nicely transferable, because they'll hopefully will elicit the kind of information about the constraints, what the constraining factors are, be it legislation or social norms or soil type, just to understand in the round what the limitations are that are faced by managers, and that can hopefully be something that is of use and can inform wider kind of policy and the advice that organisations such as RFS and others can give, and training that we can try and organise thereafter. So yeah, hopefully that part will be reasonably well generalisable to forest managers rather than necessarily forests themselves, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I can certainly see there's going to be, already just from the questions we've had, and there's going to be potential for another 20 different projects that sort of spin off from this. But that's good in some, I know, finding out what we don't know, what we need to find out, beyond is all part of it as well. And just a final thank you from me to our presenters today. So thank you Ruth, thank you Norman, Thank you, Chris. Really interesting presentations, really interesting discussion that we've had. Yeah, and then we'll certainly would like to hear more. I mean, obviously you've only just really started. It's going to be some really interesting results that come out from this, and I can already commit ourselves as the RFS be very happy to disseminate the results through our different media as they come through. So I know you've got a lot of work to do to get something with that, but yeah, we look forward to finding out what you find out. Okay, so thank you everyone, and yeah, goodbye.